I always find it perplexing when people claim that the new national populism is a threat to life, liberty, and democracy in Europe. Because the reason I find that perplexing is because there is indeed a threat to life, liberty, and democracy in Europe, but it isn't coming from populism, it's coming from anti-populism. It isn't populists who have been beating, shooting, and maiming protesters in France for the past 6 months, causing scores of them to lose their eyes and to lose limbs. It's anti-populists who are doing that. In fact, it's the anti-populists' number one hero, Emmanuel Macron, who is overseeing this extreme state violence and clampdown on French liberty. It isn't populists who are seeking to overthrow the largest democratic vote in UK history, the vote for Brexit, and in the process threatening to undermine the very principle of the right to vote. It's anti-populists who are doing that. It is anti-populists who, exactly as we have been celebrating the 100th anniversary of women and working class men getting the vote, are trying to block something that was voted for by 8 million women and millions of working class men. It isn't populists who are marching through the streets in their thousands, waving placards mocking the stupidity of ordinary people and demanding that the state unilaterally override these people's democratic wishes. It's anti-populists who are doing that. It isn't populists who immiserated the Greek working classes in order to shore up the reserves of the European Central Bank. It's anti-populists who did that. It isn't populists who have tried to interfere in the programs of democratically elected governments in Hungary and Italy. It's anti-populists. And it isn't populists who have enforced the ideology of Fortress Europe and even paid African mercenaries to imprison and torture African migrants in order to prevent them from coming to Europe. It's anti-populists who did that. If you want to see real, violent, life-threatening racism in Europe today, you shouldn't look at populists, you should look at anti-populists. The real danger in Europe today, in political terms, is anti-populism. The real danger is the shrill, often violent backlash of the technocratic elites against the rise of national populist sentiment. The opponents of populism, whether it's Tony Blair, Emmanuel Macron, the European Union, The Guardian, whoever else it might be, the opponents of populism pose a greater threat, I would say, to democratic politics and to liberty in Europe than populists do. Now, the reason I'm pointing out the violent, illiberal, and anti-democratic nature of anti-populism is not simply to say, your political creed is worse than mine, even though it absolutely is. It is really to get to the root of the populist revolt itself by asking this question. Why has the response to the populist revolt, why has the response to the populist events that Paul mentioned and others too, why has it been so unhinged and so destructive? Why have states used extreme violence against the populist upsurge? Why do the political and cultural elites, I think this is the key question, why do they seem willing to trash democracy itself in order to curtail the populist moment? What is that about? The reaction is important because it reveals, I think, how radical and important and good and positive the populist moment is. The populist moment is often presented as a far-right phenomenon, a resurgence of racist hatred, even as a return of the old politics and hatreds of the 1930s. I think that's nonsense. In reality, the populist upsurge, the populist revolt, consists of ordinary people having a reckoning with the political system. Ordinary people confronting the technocratic system of politics that has existed for a few decades now. Ordinary people seeking out new forms of solidarity, we can see that explicitly in France, and new opportunities to have their voices heard. To some people, especially those who inhabit the political bubble or the academic sphere, any politics that comes from below looks frightening. To these people, decision-making is something that should be done in seminar rooms or committee rooms. When it happens on the street, as it has been in France, or when it happens in pubs, in conversations between Brexit voters, or when it happens in parts of the United Kingdom which politicians had forgotten about and wished didn't exist, When it happens there, they find it terrifying, they find it scary. They have a tendency to see any politics which is popular, and that is what populism means. Populism means politics that appeals to a large number of a section of the populace. They think any politics which is popular is inherently dangerous and prejudiced. I think the opposite is the case. The populist moment, the populist revolt, the populist upsurge is, in my view, very positive. And what it fundamentally does is challenge the insulation of politics from public reckoning and public decision-making. This is a process that has been gathering steam throughout the whole post-war period, the increasing insulation of decision-making from ordinary people. We see that with the institutions of the European Union. We see it with the way in which the judiciary now makes decisions that were traditionally made in a more democratic way. We see it in the rise of quangos. We see increasingly the removal of key political, economic, moral questions from the democratic sphere into a sphere that people like us, ordinary mortals, have very little access to. And the populist moment is people saying, we want to overturn that situation, and we want to be heard, and we want to be taken seriously. It is, in my mind, it's not like the 1930s, which everyone always says, it's more like the 1840s. It really is this unformed, unpredictable, sometimes wonderful, sometimes a bit scary, revolt that is sweeping Europe in many different ways. But the thing that all of these different upsurges have in common is that this is a largely bottom-up phenomenon, ordinary people taking a lead or desiring to take a lead and saying one simple thing: our voices matter as much as yours, and you really ought to listen to us.